Before synthetic fertilizers and fancy tools, 1930s gardeners relied on creativity, compost, and common sense. From homemade hotbeds to smoky frost shields, their resourceful methods turned hard times into harvests. Here are 25 forgotten tricks that really worked, and the proof behind them. Before electric heating mats or greenhouses, Depression-era gardeners turned to something much more available: horse manure. These manure furnaces powered early seed germination long before the spring thaw. Fresh, stable manure was piled beneath a shallow layer of soil inside wooden frames, creating a natural compost heater. As the manure decomposed, it released steady, gentle warmth, just enough to keep the soil above freezing. Families would start cabbage, lettuce, and tomato seedlings weeks before their neighbors, gaining a vital head start on food production. According to K-State Research and Extension, properly managed hotbeds could maintain soil temperatures near 70 degrees Fahrenheit even in freezing weather. It smelled earthy, it required turning, but it worked. This was biology turned survival strategy, a perfect example of how the 1930s gardener used decay itself to grow life. When glass houses were out of reach for most families, cold frames filled the gap. Built from scrap lumber, soil, and an old window sash, these miniature greenhouses trapped the sun's warmth and protected tender plants from wind and frost. Gardeners could harden off seedlings weeks earlier than usual, or keep greens like lettuce and spinach alive deep into winter. At Hancock's Resolution, a preserved 1930s homestead, these frames were vital tools for self-sufficiency. Every morning, gardeners would prop the lids open for ventilation, then close them at night to conserve heat. Inside, the microclimate could be 10 to 20 degrees warmer than the outside air. Simple physics, no electricity. It was the working man's greenhouse, proof that with a bit of glass and grit, you could outsmart the seasons. Before plastic cloches and row covers, gardeners reached for a household staple: waxed paper. These hot caps, small domes made from wax-coated paper, acted as personal greenhouses for each plant. They trapped heat, shielded against wind, and kept early frost at bay. According to extension publications from the University of Nebraska, waxed paper caps could raise air temperature around young plants by up to 10 degrees. Farmers often placed them over tomato and pepper transplants, punching small holes for ventilation. When the sun hit, moisture condensed inside like a miniature terrarium, keeping the plant warm and hydrated. They were cheap, disposable, and surprisingly effective. Kids would sometimes help cut and fold them from old grocery wrapping paper. A sea of little white domes across a Depression-era garden meant one thing: someone was getting a jump on spring. Before synthetic fungicides, gardeners relied on a blue potion that looked straight out of a chemistry lab. Called Bordeaux mixture, it was a blend of copper sulfate and lime, developed in 19th century France to fight grape blight. And by the 1930s, it was the gold standard against fungal diseases on tomatoes, potatoes, and fruit trees. The mixture left a distinct sky blue coating on leaves, signaling protection against mildew and rot. Researchers at the University of Minnesota Conservancy confirmed that the copper ions disrupted fungal spores before they could germinate. Farmers mixed it in barrels and applied it with hand pumps, often wearing little more than a bandana for protection. It was messy, imperfect, and turned everything blue, but it saved crops. For gardeners fighting to put food on the table, that blue dust meant survival. For orchard owners, winter wasn't downtime, it was pest control. Season. Long before commercial insecticides, gardeners mixed lime and sulfur into a thick yellow wash and sprayed it over dormant fruit trees. According to Oregon State University archives, this potent brew killed overwintering mites, scales, and fungal spores hiding in the bark. When applied in late winter, it cleaned the slate before buds broke. The smell? Awful, like rotten eggs and chemistry combined. But it worked. Sprayers would often use hand-pumped tanks or homemade rigs, cobbled from garden hoses and kettles. The mixture not only reduced disease but also polished the bark, giving trees that clean, grayish look that old orchard photos often show. It was harsh homemade science, yet it laid the groundwork for modern integrated pest management. Before synthetic insecticides, gardeners weaponized tobacco. Nicotine sulfate, made by steeping tobacco leaves in water and adding soap, created a powerful natural pesticide. It paralyzed aphids, whiteflies, and caterpillars on contact. Government pamphlets from the 1930s recommended this formula for nearly every garden pest. Farmers mixed it in galvanized buckets and sprayed it by hand, often without gloves or masks. The smell was strong, the effect immediate. A few hours later, you'd see curled leaves and dead insects. It was deadly to bugs and risky for people, but it worked so well that it stayed in use until the 1950s. In the middle of the Depression, when every leaf mattered, gardeners didn't worry about regulations. They worried about losing their harvest. Nicotine sprays were their secret weapon. One of the gentler tricks from the 1930s was simple: soap and water. Gardeners discovered that ordinary soap, when diluted properly, broke down the waxy coating of soft-bodied insects like aphids and mealybugs. This caused them to dehydrate and die, all without harming the plant. The Arboriculture Journal notes that these soap washes were often made with leftover household soap flakes or even homemade lye soap. People would scrub their plants with rags or use hand sprayers repurposed from paint bottles. It was a rare example of eco-friendly pest control before anyone used the term. Cheap, safe, and surprisingly effective, soap sprays became a Depression staple. In an era when store-bought wasn't an option, the answer was often sitting by the washboard. Before petroleum was seen as poison, it was seen as possibility. Gardeners in the 1930s used kerosene emulsions, a mixture of oil, soap, and water, to smother scale insects and mites on trees. Trove archives from Australian and American agricultural bulletins describe how small-scale farmers mixed a pint of kerosene with soap flakes until creamy, then diluted it in water. The result? An oil film that suffocated pests without burning the bark when applied correctly. Timing was everything. Use it too strong, and you'd strip the leaves. Too weak, and insects thrived. It was risky, hands-on chemistry in the backyard. The smell of kerosene and soap meant pest season had arrived. Dangerous by today's standards, but in 1930, it was cutting-edge pest control that farmers swore by. Few garden chemicals have a darker legacy. In the 1930s, lead arsenate was hailed as the ultimate answer to codling moths, the worms that ruined America's apples. Extension reports from Virginia Tech show how widespread it became. Every orchard, every sprayer, every season. It worked remarkably well, coating fruit with a fine white dust that poisoned larvae before they burrowed in. But the danger lingered. Lead and arsenic do not break down, they built up in soils and workers alike. At the time, no one knew. Farmers praised its results and taught their sons how to mix it. Decades later, the soil still remembers. In the 1930s, though, it was science's gift to growers. A silver bullet with a price no one yet understood. If nicotine was nature's pesticide, pyrethrum was its gentler cousin. Made from dried chrysanthemum flowers, pyrethrum dusts were prized for knocking down insects quickly without harming plants. In the 1930s, gardeners grew their own chrysanthemums, dried the blooms, and ground them into powder. Mixed with sulfur or clay, this dust became a contact insecticide for everything from flies to garden beetles. Agricultural journals of the time praised its instant stun effect. Insects dropped seconds after exposure. Unlike many chemicals of the era, pyrethrum left no lasting residue and was safe for food crops. It was the elegant solution in a world of crude poisons. Flowers that fought back. A fragrant floral defense line drawn right in the rows of cabbage and corn. It sounds like a joke, but it's true. Beer saved more lettuce in the 1930s than any pesticide. Slugs were a menace in moist garden beds, devouring tender greens overnight. Gardeners discovered that slugs couldn't resist the smell of yeast. They'd sink shallow tins or jars into the soil and fill them with cheap beer, or even homemade brews gone sour. By morning, the traps were full of drowned slugs. Extension bulletins from the period confirm how common this practice became. It was simple chemistry. The yeast produced carbon dioxide and aroma compounds that lured pests better than any bait. For thrifty gardeners, even leftover bread dough or fermented fruit scraps worked. The trick cost almost nothing, fit the waste-nothing mindset of the Depression, and genuinely worked. A cold one for you and one for the slugs. Nothing went to waste in the 1930s, not even the fireplace ash. Gardeners sprinkled wood ash around fruit trees and vegetable beds as a natural source of potassium, lime, and trace minerals. According to extension circulars of the time, a pound of hardwood ash could supply nutrients comparable to a small dose of commercial potash fertilizer. It also helped neutralize acidic soils, a big plus for regions plagued by sour earth. The trick was moderation. Too much ash raised pH and burned roots, so careful gardeners sifted it thinly or mixed it into compost. Old-timers sometimes dusted cabbage leaves with ash to repel insects or sprinkle it in rows to deter cutworms. The sight of a gray dusting over the garden meant thrift, experience, and respect for chemistry learned by the firelight. One person's ashes were another's miracle grow. Before plastic bins and fancy tumblers, composting meant digging a trench. Depression-era guides recommended burying kitchen waste, peels, coffee grounds, even bones, directly in the garden. Gardeners dug narrow trenches about a foot deep, filled them with scraps, then covered them with soil as they planted new rows. Over the season, microbes and worms transformed the buried waste into rich humus. It required no turning, no hauling, and no tools, perfect for families without equipment. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's 1934 bulletins promoted trench composting as a sanitary way to handle food waste while improving poor soils. It was recycling before the word. Some gardeners even rotated trenches year to year, creating invisible compost factories beneath their feet. It was simple, practical alchemy. Garbage in, fertility out. A literal underground movement in the fight against hunger. By the 1930s, a new method was spreading from India to American experiment stations, the Indore process, pioneered by Sir Albert Howard. It taught gardeners to layer green waste, manure, and soil in precise proportions to create perfect compost. Agricultural colleges called it scientific composting. Instead of dumping materials randomly, gardeners built rectangular pits or stacks with alternating layers, leaves, manure, kitchen scrap, and soil, then turned them every few weeks. The mixture heated naturally, killing weed seeds and pathogens while retaining nutrients. Manuals from the period praised the method for restoring soil fertility without costly fertilizers. In an era when every scrap mattered, the Indore process turned waste into wealth. It wasn't just a gardening trick, it was the birth of modern organic farming, proving that compost could be chemistry as much as it was common sense. It was smelly, but it worked wonders. Depression-era gardeners made their own fish emulsion by fermenting leftover fish parts in barrels of water for weeks. The result was a dark, nutrient-rich liquid packed with nitrogen and trace minerals. K-State and Extension records note that it boosted leafy growth in corn, cabbage, and tomatoes. The smell was infamous. Neighbors could tell when Fish Tea Day arrived, but the results were undeniable. Native Americans had used similar techniques for centuries, and 1930s gardeners revived the practice out of necessity. A single quart diluted in water could feed an entire row of vegetables. It wasn't pleasant, but when you're growing for survival, you don't complain about the odor. The old-timers joked, It's not perfume, it's progress. And for many, it really was the difference between a thin harvest and a full pantry. Seed diseases like smut and wilt were silent killers in the 1930s, wiping out entire crops before they sprouted. With no access to modern fungicides, agricultural researchers taught farmers a simple trick: use hot water. Seeds were soaked in precisely heated water, around 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, for 10 to 30 minutes, depending on the crop. The heat killed fungal spores and bacteria clinging to the seed coat, but spared the seed embryo inside. Agricultural stations published careful temperature charts for each vegetable, and careful gardeners followed them with thermometers borrowed from the kitchen. It was delicate work: too hot and you cooked your seed stock, too cool and the diseases survived. But when done right, it saved entire harvests. It was science meeting survival in a saucepan, a trick that proved cleanliness could be as powerful as any chemical. You couldn't waste seed in the 1930s, so you tested it first. The ragdoll test, a simple home germination method, spread through agricultural newsletters and 4-H clubs. Gardeners wrapped a sample of seeds in a damp strip of cloth, often an old handkerchief or rag, then rolled it up and kept it warm for a few days. After a week, they'd unroll it and count how many seeds sprouted. If fewer than half had germinated, they knew to sow thicker or replace their seed. It was quick, cheap, and surprisingly accurate. Universities like Iowa State taught the method to farm families through radio programs and pamphlets. It was citizen science before anyone called it that, empowering gardeners to measure, record, and... The name ragdoll came from how the seed bundles looked: humble, homemade, but full of life waiting to wake up. Before plastic sheeting and fine mesh, Depression-era gardeners used cheesecloth to guard their crops. They draped the lightweight fabric over hoops or frames to protect tender seedlings from insects, wind, and harsh sun. In some regions, tobacco growers used it to shade their plants, so home gardeners borrowed the idea for lettuce and cabbage. Cheesecloth allowed air and rain through while blocking grasshoppers, beetles, and moths. Agricultural manuals from the 1930s noted that yields improved dramatically when the cloth was kept taut and clean. Some families washed and reused the same fabric for years, patching it like a prized quilt. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ingenious, turning a kitchen staple into a barrier between survival and starvation. Those fluttering white tents across garden rows were the Depression's version of climate control. If you saw someone in the 1930s walking through their garden with a burlap sack puffing yellow powder onto leaves, they weren't being strange, they were dusting sulfur. This ancient mineral was the go-to cure for mildew, rust, and mites. Farmers had used it for centuries, but 1930s science confirmed how it worked. When heated by the sun, sulfur released tiny amounts of gas that killed fungal spores. Gardeners dusted their grapevines, beans, and roses with hand bellows or shaken flour sacks. It left a sulfurous smell and a yellow tint on everything it touched, but it stopped disease cold. The trick was timing: dust in the morning dew and it burned the plants, dust in dry weather and it worked beautifully. It was crude chemistry with centuries of proof, and one of the few remedies both organic and effective. When weeds stole moisture and labor was scarce, gardeners turned to paper. Old newspapers, feed sacks, and even brown wrapping paper were spread between rows to trap moisture and smother weeds. According to 1930s agricultural reports, paper mulch kept soil temperatures stable and reduced watering needs by half. Some gardeners wet the paper first so it would mold to the ground, then held it down with soil or stones. Others painted the paper with kerosene to make it last longer, a trick now lost to history. As the season went on, the paper broke down into compost, enriching the soil. In an era where every drop of water and ounce of energy counted, this trick saved both. It was sustainability before the word existed. Newspaper headlines one week, thriving tomatoes the next. When late spring frost threatened the year's food supply, gardeners didn't surrender. They smoked it out. Walk through any 1930s orchard and you'd see tree trunks painted ghostly white. That wasn't decoration, it was defense. Whitewash, a simple mix of lime and water, protected bark from sun scald, the cracking that occurred when winter sun warmed one side of a tree and freezing night followed. Extension records show that the white coating reflected sunlight, keeping bark temperature even and discouraging borers and fungus. Gardeners mixed the wash in buckets and brushed it on every winter, sometimes adding salt or milk for better adhesion. The result was eerie but effective, a row of white sentinels guarding against the elements. It became a cultural symbol of good orchard keeping. Even today, old barns and fruit trees in historic photos bear that chalky proof of Depression-era diligence and timeless practicality. Before polyethylene sheets existed, gardeners used whatever fabric they could. To extend the growing season, old sheets, flour sacks, and muslin curtains became makeshift row covers, stretched over bent wire or wood frames. They protected tender crops from frost, hail, and insects while letting in just enough light and air. Period horticultural guides praised the method for giving plants 2 extra weeks of spring and fall. Families in colder climates swore by it for tomatoes, cucumbers, and melons. The fabrics wore out quickly, but they were endlessly repaired, patched, and reused. In the evenings, you'd see gardens glowing faintly under pale cloth, like ghostly fields. It was a blend of necessity and ingenuity, proof that a little fabric and faith could bend the growing season to human will. Few pests caused more heartbreak than the cutworm, those sneaky larvae that slice through seedlings overnight. The 1930 solution was as clever as it was simple: collars. Gardeners cut strips of cardboard, tin cans, or even corn husks and placed them around each young plant, forming a miniature fortress. Cutworms couldn't crawl over the barrier, and the plants grew safely past their vulnerable stage. Agricultural pamphlets urged every family gardener to use them, and children often made hundreds as a household chore. Tin collars from discarded cans were prized because they lasted all season. It was low-tech pest control that really worked, and it turned waste into protection. In a time when one lost row of cabbage could mean less food on the table, a handful of collars made the difference between failure and feast. It might sound like witchcraft, but in the 1930s, gardeners brewed compost like coffee. Compost tea was made by steeping finished compost or manure in barrels of water for several days, stirring daily. The resulting liquid was a rich, brown nutrient soup used to water plants and jumpstart growth. Farmers found that the soluble nutrients, especially nitrogen and potassium, gave vegetables a visible boost. It was essentially liquid fertilizer created with zero waste. Extension agents promoted it as a way to feed plants and soil together. The smell was infamous, but the results spoke for themselves. Greener leaves, faster growth, and better yields. Gardeners even applied it as a foliar spray long before anyone knew about micronutrients. It was part science, part superstition, but entirely effective. For Depression-era families, compost tea was proof that even waste could give life. These 25 Depression-era gardening tricks remind us that innovation doesn't always come from labs. It often grows from necessity. From beer traps to manure furnaces, each hack was few pests caused more heartbreak than the cutworm, those sneaky larvae that slice through seedlings overnight. The 1930 solution was as clever as it was simple: collars. Gardeners cut strips of cardboard, tin cans, or even corn husks and placed them around each young plant, forming a miniature fortress. Cutworms couldn't crawl over the barrier, and the plants grew safely past their vulnerable stems. Agricultural pamphlets urged every family gardener to use them, and children often made hundreds as a household chore. Tin collars from discarded cans were prized because they lasted all season. It was low-tech pest control that really worked, and it turned waste into protection. In a time when one lost row of cabbage could mean less food on the table, a handful of collars made the difference between failure and feast. It might sound like witchcraft, but in the 1930s, gardeners brewed compost like coffee. Compost tea was made by steeping finished compost or manure in barrels of water for several days, stirring daily. The resulting liquid was a rich, brown nutrient soup used to water plants and jumpstart growth. Farmers found that the soluble nutrients, especially nitrogen and potassium, gave vegetables a visible boost. It was essentially liquid fertilizer created with zero waste. Extension agents promoted it as a way to feed plants and soil together. The smell was infamous, but the results spoke for themselves: greener leaves, faster growth, and better yields. Gardeners even applied it as a foliar spray long before anyone knew about micronutrients. It was part science, part superstition, but entirely effective. For Depression-era families, compost tea was proof that even waste could give life. These 25 Depression-era gardening tricks remind us that innovation doesn't always come from labs, it often grows from necessity.